I enjoyed working with Ed Sakamoto. His writings are just, they touch the human spirit. It's not like a soap opera where there's conflict and drama all the time. Ed was very human about it. You could understand his characters as if it were you. My first gig with Ed was with under the direction of his pal Jim Nakamoto, who had a very large effect on my getting into theater. And I'm really thankful to Jim for allowing me to work with these various productions, and I'm happy I had a chance to work with Ed too.
I know Jim back in the day when I was in high school in the early 70s. What we learned from theater was not like for me as an actor, before we did any of that, we learned how to clean the theater. We learned how to clean the dressing rooms. We learned lighting. We learned sound. Jim would guest direct at different theater groups and such and whatnot. And he would always take some of his students overseas to see what was happening in the other parts of the world. Jim was such a legend in terms of creating this educational force through the arts. Well, if you're a student of Jim Nakamoto, we always called him Mr. Nak. And to the very end, I could never call him Jim. No, it was always Mr. Nak, Mr. Nak.
My first play ever was in 1989. The play was called Manoa Valley, written by Ed Sakamoto. Ed was just one of those writers who just knew how to focus in on the really meaningful things in life and the relationships between people. Now, Ed is a graduate of Iolani School, class of 58. And so a lot of his classmates would support him whenever he was back in town, because he lived in LA. Whenever he was back in town for us doing one of his shows, a lot of his Iolani School classmates would show up to support him at the play. And every once in a while, at the end of the play, when people would greet the cast members, Ed, who would be there, would say, "Oh, hey, this is Roger. You know, Roger, the character in the play? Well, he's named after this real Roger, one of my classmates. Oh, and this is Roger's wife, Shirley. You know, Shirley, the other character in the play? Yeah, that's named after Roger's wife." He came to a lot of the rehearsals just prior to opening. He would pace in the back of the room. I mean, way in the back of the room. You could see him. We were rehearsing. He was way in the back of the room, and you could see him walking back and forth, back and forth. And every once in a while, he would sit down in the last row or chair there in the back of the room, and he would look at his knee. Literally, he would stare at his knee. He never looked at us on the stage rehearsing. So, since I had never done a play before, my initial reaction was, holy smokes, we must be screwing up royally here. I mean, we really must be doing bad, because look, he's not smiling, he's not happy, he's just pacing around back there, and he's staring at his knee. He told me later, because I commented on that. I said, "Hey, Ed, how come you're always staring at your knee instead of watching us on the stage?" He goes, "I'm listening to my words. I don't need to see you folks, because I know you folks are doing great. I just need to hear my word."
I was really fortunate to work with Jim Nakamoto and Ed Sakamoto in one production called Stew Rice. And I was really lucky and looking forward to working with Jim and even meeting Ed Sakamoto, the playwright, because they have such a long legacy at Kumakahua Theater and in Hawaii in general. And so he's pretty well known. And Jim Nakamoto has such a strong legacy in Honolulu and in Hawaii, being a drama teacher at McKinley. He has so many students that came up under his mentorship. And he directed so many plays, not just at Kumakahua, but at other theaters and even at Blaisdell and at the Okinawan Center. He produced and directed many shows. And so I was really fortunate and lucky to get into Stew Rice so that I could meet both of them The one thing I remember that I would describe Jim Nakamoto as is kind. He would get fiery at times, but for the most part, he's actually a really gentle soul. He always had a vision. He knew what he wanted. He was clear on what he wanted to do as far as the direction he gave us. But he also let us play too, as far as what choices we made as actors. He was really proud of his Japanese heritage. He was particularly interested and tied to shows or productions or plays that featured Asian actors or Asian characters, and Asians in Hawaii, particular tied to Hawaii. And that is why I think he gelled so well with Ed Sakamoto, because Ed Sakamoto told those stories. Many of Ed Sakamoto's plays were about Japanese families, Japanese characters in Hawaii, or moving away from Hawaii or coming back to Hawaii. So they worked really well together. I had known about Ed for years because of all his plays, and I've seen many of his plays, but I didn't get to meet Ed until he came for right before we had preview, the last week. They call it Hell Week in theater. The last week of rehearsals, dress rehearsals, he flew in from LA and watched our dress rehearsals. Ed wanted to change some of the direction, and Jim was a little bit resistant of that. And it was a few days before we had an audience, and they compromised because there were some changes that were made to some of the blocking on Ed's request. And they would get a little bit heated with each other. But what's interesting is they had this kind of brotherly relationship in a way that Jim always directed Ed's shows, and Ed trusted Jim, and Jim trusted Ed. And they had this relationship where they could get angry with each other or tell each other what they didn't like, and they worked through it.
That kind of collaboration between a writer and a director, where they can trust each other so much to listen to each other, I think is a wonderful thing, and something that I've always kind of tried to aspire to when working on plays with a living writer.